The evening air carried a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as though the land itself had grown weary of sound. A faint breeze moved across the empty fields, stirring the tall grass into a slow, uneven rhythm. In the distance, the faint silhouette of a small settlement could just barely be seen. Wooden homes standing low and plain, smoke from their chimneys drifting upward in fragile threads. The settlement was ordinary, unremarkable, yet within those walls were lives filled with endless labor, quiet endurance, and unspoken burdens. The year was far removed from modern times, back when survival meant the simplest tasks demanded the greatest energy. In this place, people rose before the sun and worked long after it fell, and life revolved around what little could be coaxed from the soil, the animals, and the fragile sense of community. Their lives did not make it into great books, nor would their names be carved into stone. But they were lives nonetheless, hard, real, and, quietly, significant. The focus of this story begins with the women of the settlement. They were rarely acknowledged in accounts of history, yet their hands shaped every single day of existence. Before the faint glow of dawn even touched the horizon, they had already risen from their straw beds. The floors beneath their feet were rough and splintered, yet their movements were steady, practiced, never hesitant. They moved as though directed by an invisible rhythm that had been drilled into them since childhood. The gathering of water, the tending of fires, the preparation of bread. Every task flowed into the next with a seamless monotony. The cold mornings bit into their skin, but there was no pause. A young girl, no more than 13, carried a wooden bucket almost as large as her upper body. The weight of the water inside bent her spine slightly, and yet she trudged forward, her lips pressed tight. She said nothing, not even when her arms trembled from the strain. That was the nature of their lives. Complaints were a luxury no one could afford. Inside the low-roofed homes, the air smelled of smoke, wool, and earth. The walls were lined with tools, simple, handmade, and worn smooth by years of constant use. Women bent over wooden tables, kneading coarse dough with hands hardened by endless repetition. Their knuckles cracked, their nails were short and stained, but the bread would rise just enough to keep hunger at bay for another day. Children stirred awake on the floor, rubbing their eyes with dirt-stained hands, their hair tangled and wild. The older girls immediately joined their mothers in the routine, pulling on coarse linen garments, their fingers clumsy with half-sleep, but determined nonetheless. The boys would be sent out soon to the fields or to tend the animals, but in these first hours of the morning, the house was ruled by the quiet, relentless labor of the women. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, the settlement came alive with muted activity. Smoke rose higher, animals stirred in their pens, and the muffled voices of neighbors carried faintly through the air. There was little joy in these sounds, no bursts of laughter, but there was a sense of continuation. Life pressed forward, whether welcomed or not. Beyond the settlement, the fields stretched far and unforgiving. The soil was stubborn, demanding more than it ever offered. Women walked those fields just as often as men, stooping low to gather herbs, berries, and roots, their fingers stained by the earth. Their eyes scanned every patch of growth, searching for anything that could be used to stretch meals just a little further. A small handful of wild greens could mean the difference between a bland broth and something with at least a trace of nourishment. The women's days were not measured in hours, but in tasks. There was no end of work, only a shifting of duties. Once the morning fires had been tended and the bread set to bake, there were clothes to mend. Thick, uneven threads stitched through torn wool garments, their seams rough but functional. Fingers pricked by needles left faint smudges of blood on the fabric, but no one paused to notice. Clothing was precious. Nothing was discarded until it was completely beyond repair. The afternoons were no easier. The sun bore down harshly, and sweat dampened the backs of their dresses. But still they bent over the wash, scrubbing coarse cloth against stones until their arms ached. The water, cold and unforgiving, reddened their hands, but the garments had to be clean, or at least less stained than before. Beside the stream, women worked in silence, occasionally trading short, clipped words about weather or illness, but never indulging in idle chatter. There was no room for leisure, and every sentence carried the weight of necessity. Meals were a constant worry. Food was not abundant, and the women knew how to stretch the smallest scraps into something that could fill stomachs. A bone boiled for hours might lend enough flavor to disguise the thinness of the broth. Grains, pounded and boiled, became a heavy porridge that stuck in the gut long after its bland taste had been swallowed. Children often asked for more, their wide eyes full of hope. But the answer was almost always the same. A quiet shake of the head, or a hand pressed gently but firmly against their small shoulders. Illness was another shadow over daily life. When a child coughed too long, or when a fever lingered, the women tried every method passed down through generations. Herbs boiled into bitter teas, poultices pressed against the skin, whispered prayers spoken into the darkness. Sometimes it worked. More often it did not. The women bore this weight silently because they had no choice. Their grief had to be carried even as their hands continued to churn butter, sew garments, and tend to the living. Evening did not bring rest. As the sun set and shadows stretched across the land, the settlement grew quieter, but the women's work shifted once again. Fires had to be maintained, food prepared for the next day, children soothed to sleep. In the dim light of flickering candles, their faces looked older than their years, etched with lines of exhaustion. Their backs bent, their hands raw, but still they moved, one task into the next, as though bound to a rhythm older than memory itself. Their lives were not filled with dramatic moments of triumph or tragedy, not the kind sung in ballads or written in chronicles. Instead, their story was one of unrelenting endurance. They lived in the background, unseen, unrecorded, yet everything around them, the homes, the fields, the very survival of their families, depended on the labor they carried out in silence. By the time true night fell, silence returned to the settlement. The children slept on their straw mats, men lay exhausted from the fields, and the women finally allowed themselves to rest. Their bodies sank into the uneven bedding, their muscles sore, their skin covered in the faint smell of smoke and earth. Sleep was not always peaceful, but it was necessary, for dawn would bring the same endless cycle once more. Their story is not one of heroes or grand events, but of the quiet weight of existence, lives lived in repetition, where meaning was not found in greatness, but in the simple, stubborn act of continuing forward despite everything. The days in the settlement did not change much from one to the next. Life moved forward in a rhythm that seemed endless, each season blending into the other with only subtle shifts. What made the difference, what brought depth to the monotony, was the small details, the ways people endured, the tiny moments that revealed how survival was stitched together with patience and suffering. In the heart of the settlement, the women bore the heaviest share of this existence. The world outside rarely saw them, and when it did not recognize their worth. They were not written into records, not praised in sermons, and not remembered in songs. Yet, without them, nothing could have endured. The second layer of their struggle was not only the endless work, but the expectations placed upon them since birth. From the earliest years, girls were trained to bear weight, not just with their arms and hands, but with their whole bodies and minds. A girl of 5 was already tasked with carrying small bundles of sticks from the forest, her small fingers gripping tightly to keep from dropping them. By 7, she was expected to help grind grain, her fragile arms pushing and pulling the heavy stone mill, her face damp with sweat. At 10, She was already watching over younger siblings while her mother worked, holding a crying infant on one hip while stirring a pot with her other hand. Childhood was not a season for them. It was a brief preparation for a lifetime of burden. Marriage, too, was less a matter of choice than of necessity. Families arranged unions not for love, but for survival. A daughter was another mouth to feed, and marrying her into another household meant lightening the weight, while also securing ties between families. Many girls married before they were fully grown, their bodies still fragile, their minds still clinging to the faint threads of girlhood. They entered homes where they were strangers, expected to obey, to work, to bear children, and to endure whatever hardships came. In those homes, the cycle continued. A wife's life was defined by duty, not by freedom. Her day was filled with tasks that began before the sun rose and ended only when exhaustion pressed her into sleep. She tended fires, prepared meals, spun wool, wove fabric, and stitched garments. Her hands rarely rested, her eyes constantly searching for what needed to be done next. Even in moments of sickness, she was expected to rise and continue, because there was no alternative. If she stopped, others would go hungry, the fires would die, and the fragile order of the household would collapse. The birth of children was perhaps the most grueling trial of all. There were no doctors, no medicines, no safe places to give birth. Women delivered children in dimly lit rooms with only the presence of other women to guide them. Mothers, sisters, or neighbors who had themselves endured the same ordeal. The cries of labor filled the air, raw and desperate, while the rest of the household waited anxiously, not knowing whether the mother, the child, or both might be lost before morning. Death in childbirth was common, and yet life demanded that women face this danger again and again, year after year. When children were born alive, they were both joy and burden. They brought hope, but also more mouths to feed, more work to be done. Mothers nursed them through long nights, their breasts sore and their bodies weak, while still waking at dawn to continue their endless chores. Infants often cried from hunger, from fever, or from nothing at all, but there was rarely time for comfort. A mother's arms might cradle her child, but her hands still worked at churning butter, spinning thread, or preparing meals. And then there was loss. Children often did not survive long past infancy. Illness swept through homes like an invisible thief, stealing away the smallest and weakest. Mothers wept quietly, their grief heavy but hidden, because life allowed no pause for mourning. A body would be wrapped in cloth, carried out, buried in the earth, and by the next morning, the same mother was expected to rise again, to feed the living and continue. Her sorrow became part of her, etched into the lines of her face, but her hands did not stop. Beyond their homes, women also worked in the wider tasks of the settlement. They gathered herbs in the forests, their baskets filled with plants whose names and uses had been passed down from one generation to the next. They bent low to pull weeds, their backs aching under the sun, or waded into streams to catch fish with their bare hands. Their knowledge was vast, though unacknowledged. The seasons of growth, the signs of weather, the subtle differences between plants that could heal and those that could kill. Without their quiet expertise, families would have starved, fevers would have burned unchecked, and survival itself would have faltered. Evenings often revealed another layer of hardship. While men gathered to speak of crops, trade, or disputes, women rarely had such spaces. Their conversations came in whispers, stolen during shared tasks. By the stream, washing clothes, they spoke in low tones of births, illnesses, fears, and faint dreams. Their words carried no grand visions of power or wealth, but simple hopes that a child would live, that a harvest would not fail, that winter would pass without too much hunger. These small exchanges were their only release, their only thread of connection in lives otherwise drowned in silence. And then came winter, the cruelest of seasons. The fields went barren, the air turned sharp and biting, and the settlement seemed to shrink beneath the weight of snow. Fires had to be kept burning day and night, and women labored constantly to ensure they did not go out. Food became scarce, reduced to thin broths and dried roots. Children shivered beneath wool blankets, their teeth chattering in the cold. Women often went hungry themselves, giving what little they had to their children, their own bodies weakening even as they pressed forward. The nights in winter were the longest of all. Darkness swallowed the land early, and silence stretched unbroken except for the sound of wind pressing against wooden walls. In those hours, women sat by the dim light of a candle, sewing patches onto garments already patched a dozen times before. Their eyes strained against the darkness, their fingers clumsy with numbness. But they worked on. Beside them, children slept, their small breaths rising and falling, unaware of the cost their mothers bore to keep them warm and clothed. It was in these seasons of cold and scarcity that the endurance of women shone brightest. They were not praised for it, nor thanked in any lasting way, but they carried households through the bitter months with nothing but their will, their knowledge, and their refusal to stop. Without them, winter would have claimed far more lives than it did. Their story was not written in ink, nor carved in stone, but it lived in every gesture, every scar, every weary breath. They were the backbone of survival, the silent architects of existence, and yet history looked past them, choosing instead to remember the men who fought battles, signed treaties, and claimed power. The women remained in the shadows, their lives dismissed as ordinary, their struggles labeled as unworthy of memory. But here, in the quiet rhythm of their days, the truth could not be denied. Their existence was not grand or dramatic, but it was real. It was heavy, painful, and unrelenting. And in that reality lay a story more human than any tale of kings or wars. As night fell once again on the settlement, fires dimming and voices fading, the women lay down upon their straw beds. Their bodies ached, their minds dulled by exhaustion. But even as they closed their eyes, they knew tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same burdens, the same quiet struggle. They did not dream of glory, nor of escape. They dreamed only of surviving another day, and of keeping those around them alive in a world that gave them so little. Their story was not meant to inspire, nor to entertain. It was meant to reveal what was hidden, to show the reality of those who lived unseen, those who endured without recognition. And in that endurance, though silent and uncelebrated, lay the foundation of everything that came after. The settlement existed not only through labor and survival, but also through rules that were rarely questioned, because they had always been there, older than memory itself. These rules were spoken and unspoken, reinforced by tradition, religion, and the constant whisper of fear that life could unravel at any moment if they were ignored. For women, the rules were stricter, heavier, and inescapable. From the moment they could walk, girls were taught what was expected of them. Their movements were watched, their behavior corrected, their voices silenced when they strayed too far from what was considered proper. A girl who laughed too loudly was told to be quiet. A girl who ran too far from the home was pulled back sharply. A girl who questioned why she had to do more work than her brothers was met with cold stares, or worse, silence that pressed down harder than words. Obedience was expected not only for order, but for survival. To disobey was to risk shame, punishment, or isolation from the community, a fate as heavy as hunger itself. Religion wove through every part of life. Sermons were delivered each week in a low, droning voice, echoing inside the small wooden meeting house where the entire settlement gathered. Men sat near the front, their broad shoulders hunched, their eyes half-lidded, as the words poured over them. Women sat behind, their heads lowered, their hands folded in their laps. They were expected to listen, but not to speak, to accept without question. The teachings were clear. Women were to be humble, silent, and obedient. Their worth was measured in service, their virtue in submission. After the gatherings, men would linger, speaking about trade, land, or disputes, while women returned quickly to their homes, gathering children by the hand. Their voices were quiet, their steps quick. For them, religion was not a space for authority, but another weight added to the ones they already carried. Yet, even in this silence, women carried a deep knowledge of rituals, prayers, and the quiet, unspoken faith that lived between them. At home, they whispered blessings over their children, traced patterns in the air as they stirred pots, muttered protective words when storms raged outside. Their faith was lived not in sermons, but in survival. The rules also dictated appearances. A woman's clothing had to be plain, her hair covered or bound, her movements modest. To step outside these boundaries was to invite gossip, and gossip was dangerous. Whispers spread quickly through a small settlement, attaching themselves to a woman's name like shadows. Once whispered, those shadows rarely faded. A woman accused of pride, laziness, or improper behavior might find herself shunned, her family treated with suspicion. Reputation was fragile, and for women, it was often the only shield they had. Marriage bound women even tighter into this web of rules. Once wed, they were expected to obey their husbands completely. Disagreement was seen as disobedience, and disobedience could be punished harshly. Some men ruled their households with heavy hands, their voices sharp, their tempers quick. Others were gentler, but even then the structure remained. The man was the master, the woman the servant. Love might exist in rare moments, but it was not the foundation. Duty was the foundation, and duty rarely softened into kindness. Yet beneath these rules, women found ways to carve out small spaces of quiet resistance. They could not openly challenge the order, but in the privacy of their homes, they found methods of survival that were their own. A wife might slip an extra piece of bread to a hungry child, even when her husband had ordered strict rationing. A mother might whisper forbidden stories to her daughters, tales of women who had once been strong, wise, and free, even though such stories were frowned upon. A girl might sneak moments of laughter with a friend while washing clothes by the stream, stealing brief instants of freedom before returning to silence. These small acts were never written down, never acknowledged, but they mattered. They were the beginnings of a quiet defiance, a refusal to be entirely erased. One of the unspoken rules was about pain. Women were not allowed to show too much of it. A cry during childbirth was tolerated, but once the moment passed, silence was expected. A tear shed for a lost child was understood, but to wail or refuse to rise the next morning was seen as weakness. Pain was private, grief was hidden, and endurance was the only acceptable response. Women carried sorrow like invisible weights strapped to their backs, walking through the settlement as though nothing had changed, even when their hearts had been broken. The younger girls watched all of this carefully. They saw their mothers bend under the weight of work, their grandmothers move slowly with aching joints, their older sisters married off before they could dream of anything beyond the fields and fires. They learned quickly that their own futures would look the same. Hope was dangerous, and so most of them buried it deep before it could cause them pain. And yet, within the secrecy of their own minds, some carried dreams that could not be spoken. A girl might imagine what it would feel like to walk freely into the forest without being called back, to speak her thoughts without being silenced, to live even a single day without endless work. These dreams flickered faintly, like candles threatened by the wind. Most were extinguished before they could take root, but some burned quietly, waiting. The harshest reminder of the rules came during moments of punishment. When someone disobeyed, whether a man, woman, or child, the community ensured the lesson was seen by all. Men might be fined or forced into extra labor. But for women, punishment was more often humiliation. A woman accused of gossiping too much or neglecting her duties might be made to stand in the square while others looked on. She would lower her head, shame burning into her skin, while whispers circled around her. Afterward, life continued, but the mark of that shame lingered, invisible yet heavy, reminding her and everyone else of her place. Still, even in the face of such control, life found ways to push back. In the dim glow of firelight, after the day's work was finished, mothers sometimes sang old songs to their children. Songs older than the settlement itself. Songs with words that spoke of lands far away, of freedom, of women who once held power. These songs were nearly forgotten, their meanings half lost, but the melody carried something unbreakable. The children listened, their eyes heavy with sleep, their small hearts absorbing the rhythm of resilience that no rule could erase. Community itself, though harsh, also created spaces of quiet solidarity. Women shared their burdens with one another, offering small kindnesses where they could. A neighbor might leave a bundle of herbs at another's door without saying a word, knowing it would help with sickness. A midwife might spend the night by the side of a struggling mother, holding her hand through the long hours of pain. These acts were not grand, but they were powerful, binding the women together in ways that rules could not sever. The rules dictated their lives, but they did not define the entirety of who they were. Beneath the surface, women carried their own truths, their own hidden strength. History would not remember their names, but in the silent defiance of their endurance, in the quiet rebellion of their survival, they built a legacy stronger than any written law. As another day ended, the meeting house bell rang faintly in the distance, signaling curfew. Families hurried inside, doors shut tight against the night. Candles flickered in windows for a while. Then, one by one, the settlement went dark. Inside, women lay beside their sleeping children, their bodies aching, their minds filled with the weight of rules that bound them. Yet even in the stillness, something stirred. An unspoken knowledge that their strength was greater than the silence imposed upon them. Their lives remained unseen, their voices unheard, but they endured. And in endurance, they carried the quiet seeds of change, though they would never live to see them bloom. 4. The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long, hazy shadows across the port city. Ships bobbed gently in the calm harbor, their sails tied tightly and creaking softly in the light breeze. The salty scent of the sea mingled with the faint aroma of fish being unloaded at the docks, creating a steady, calming rhythm that seemed to stretch time itself. Fishermen moved with unhurried steps, carrying baskets and nets, their motions deliberate, almost hypnotic. The sound of gulls drifting lazily above blended with the gentle lapping of water against the wooden piers, forming a lullaby for anyone paying careful attention. Among the crowds at the docks stood a man whose name would later be remembered far beyond the harbor walls, though the story of his voyages would be far more tedious than dramatic to the casual listener. Christopher Columbus, dressed in heavy fabrics that made each movement slow and careful, examined the ships before him. His expression was one of mild concern, eyes narrowing slightly at the ropes, sails, and the slow, deliberate preparations of his crew. "Ensure the rigging is correct," he murmured softly to his first mate. "Check each rope. I would rather take longer and be precise than rush into uncertainty." The crew, accustomed to the same tedious attention to detail, moved in slow synchronization. Sails were tied and retied, barrels were checked and rechecked, and maps were unfurled and folded again. Each action took longer than necessary, yet in the quiet, deliberate manner, there was a strange rhythm. An observer might have noticed nothing significant happening for hours, Yet every tiny, meticulous adjustment contributed to the eventual voyage, even if no one could yet predict where it would end. Columbus himself stood on deck, pointing out landmarks to his crew, speaking in measured tones that encouraged calm rather than excitement. There was no urgency in his voice, no dramatic proclamations. Instead, each command was deliberate, slow, and precise. The men followed, moving with the same languid efficiency, their actions blending with the gentle sway of the ships in the harbor. Farther down the pier, Marco Polo prepared for his own long journey. Hundreds of years earlier, though in this retelling, time seemed to stretch, as if the centuries blended together in a seamless, unhurried narrative. Polo's caravan was meticulously packed, camels burdened with supplies, silk, and trinkets, each item carefully weighed and positioned. The merchants accompanying him moved with deliberate steps, checking each item, adjusting the loads, ensuring that the procession would proceed at a pace that was slow but sustainable. "Do not hurry," Polo instructed his men softly. "We have time enough if we move carefully, slowly, step by step. Rushing will achieve nothing but fatigue." And so the caravan moved, a long, deliberate procession across the uneven terrain, the clatter of hooves against dirt, the gentle sway of heavy packs, the muted chatter of the men, all blended into a soft, hypnotic cadence. The desert wind carried sand lightly across the path, creating a rhythmic whisper that seemed to synchronize with every footstep. Even the camels, accustomed to long journeys, moved with deliberate grace, their breaths slow, their heads swaying gently from side to side. Back on the ships, Columbus finally set sail, though the pace was far from hurried. The waves lapped softly against the hull, the sails creaked as the wind caught them gently, and the oarsmen rowed with slow, deliberate strokes. The horizon seemed endless, stretching lazily in every direction, and the monotony of the sea mirrored the meticulous preparations of the journey. Hours passed without incident, each moment blending seamlessly into the next, a steady rhythm that could easily lull the most restless observer into quiet contemplation or sleep. Days turned into weeks, and the expedition continued in this steady, measured fashion. Sailors went about their duties with slow precision, ropes adjusted, sails trimmed, food prepared, and logs updated. Even small challenges, like minor leaks or a sudden gust of wind, were addressed methodically. No one panicked. No one shouted. Every action was deliberate, precise, and predictable. The monotony, far from dull, was almost comforting. A constant, gentle pulse against the vast, unchanging expanse of the ocean. Meanwhile, Polo's caravan trudged on across deserts and mountains. The men and animals moved in a slow, unbroken rhythm, pausing occasionally to rest, stretch, or drink. The sound of camel hooves against the hard earth created a hypnotic pattern, and the occasional whisper of the wind through sparse trees added a subtle, calming soundtrack to the long, tedious journey. The travelers adjusted loads, measured distances, and meticulously recorded their route, each step unfolding in a measured, deliberate cadence. Even mistakes were absorbed into this rhythm. A camel might stumble slightly, a sailor might misplace a rope, an apprentice might spill ink on a map. Yet each disruption was gentle, corrected slowly, seamlessly, becoming part of the ongoing pattern of life in motion. There was no urgency, no dramatic crisis, only the unhurried progression of time, each detail carefully attended to, each movement deliberate. At night, the ships rocked gently on the ocean, sails flapping softly in the wind. Columbus walked slowly across the deck, observing the positions of ropes, checking instruments, ensuring everything was as precise as possible. Stars twinkled in the sky above, distant and serene, moving imperceptibly, mirroring the patient, careful rhythm of the voyage below. The crew lay in hammocks or on the deck, breathing in sync with the gentle sway of the ship. The ocean's lullaby merged with the careful, methodical activity of every sailor, forming a calm, soothing pattern that could lull even the most awake mind toward rest. Polo's caravan camped beneath the slowly shifting stars. Fires burned low, casting soft light across the resting travelers and camels. Men whispered softly, recounting minor details of the day. Which path had more stones? Which camel had a sore hoof? Which pack was slightly misaligned? The observations were trivial, almost tedious, yet each contributed to the overall rhythm of survival and movement, and each followed the same measured pace that had defined their journey from the beginning. As days blurred into weeks, the voyages of Columbus and Polo became almost timeless, defined less by geography and more by the gentle, persistent pace of careful attention. Each action, whether raising a sail, checking a rope, adjusting a camel's burden, or marking a map, followed a deliberate cadence. Even the environment conspired to slow the mind. The endless ocean, the expansive desert, the steady rise and fall of hills and waves, the predictable patterns of stars and sun, all conspired to reinforce the calm, sleepy rhythm of the explorer's existence. Even the small, mundane interactions between the crew and the travelers followed this unhurried pattern. A sailor passed a bucket of water to another, slowly, deliberately. An apprentice adjusted a strap on a camel with careful attention. Conversations were soft, deliberate, and monotonous, covering trivial matters like food rations, weather observations, and minor complaints. Nothing was urgent. Nothing was dramatic. Everything existed in a slow, gentle flow, perfectly suited to calm the mind and encourage a restful, meditative state. By the end of each day, the ships and caravans had moved only incremental distances, yet the slow, methodical pace ensured that progress was consistent. Even exhaustion was treated with measured care. Men rested, animals were tended, supplies checked and adjusted. The monotony, repetition, and predictability of these voyages created a rhythm, a hypnotic cadence that defined every moment. And in this rhythm, in this slow, deliberate unfolding of events, the story finds its power, not in adventure, not in excitement, not in sudden drama, but in the gentle, persistent unfolding of human endeavor. The careful attention, the deliberate motions, the repetitive, measured tasks, all contribute to a subtle lullaby, one that carries the listener slowly, steadily, toward rest. By night, as Columbus's ships drifted under the stars and Polo's caravan lay beneath the desert sky, the soft pulse of careful, meticulous movement continued. The gentle sway of ships, the steady shuffle of camels, the rhythmic adjustments of explorers and crew alike created a pattern that was hypnotic in its consistency. Time itself seemed to slow, bending to the gentle cadence of deliberate human action. The voyages of Columbus and Polo, often recounted in grand tales of discovery and adventure, are equally stories of slow, deliberate, mundane progress. And in this slow rhythm lies a different kind of fascination, a quiet, meditative flow of events that draws the listener into its unhurried pace. A story told not to thrill or excite, but to soothe, to relax, and to guide the mind toward gentle, untroubled sleep. The first light of dawn crept gently over the horizon, spilling soft gold across fields and rivers. Villages in medieval Europe began to stir, but not in a hurried, dramatic way. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost measured, like each person had been practicing patience for generations. Smoke drifted lazily from small chimneys, curling upward into the still morning air. Chickens clucked softly, moving from one patch of grass to another, their steps unhurried and methodical. The faint scent of baking bread mixed with dew-laden grass, creating an aroma both comforting and calming. In a small European village, the townsfolk were starting their day, and each action unfolded with a gentle precision. Women carried buckets of water, their steps careful to avoid spilling a drop. Men guided carts along the dirt streets, wheels creaking softly. Children ambled behind, gathering small stones or chasing a butterfly slowly, not racing, but allowing each moment to extend, almost savoring the boredom. Every movement seemed to echo a rhythm, a cadence that encouraged calm and quiet reflection rather than excitement or urgency. Inside one modest cottage, a family was beginning the morning routine. The father, dressed in simple homespun garments, polished wooden utensils with deliberate care, examining each for small cracks or imperfections. The mother baked bread, kneading the dough slowly, methodically, as if every fold and press were a meditation. The children watched quietly, learning the rhythm of domestic life. There was no rush, no dramatic urgency. Each task, though mundane, carried a sense of careful attention and gentle purpose. Outside, the village blacksmith struck metal with deliberate force, each hammer blow measured, allowing the iron to bend and shape without unnecessary haste. Sparks flew, but not wildly. They scattered lazily, floating in the air before settling to the ground. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal created a soft, hypnotic beat, almost like a lullaby. Villagers passed by, pausing to watch but never interrupting, their steps slow, their conversations soft and subdued. Even the animals participated in the unhurried pace. Horses in the stable shifted weight from hoof to hoof slowly, their ears twitching in minimal, deliberate movements. Goats ambled across the fields, chewing each bite of grass carefully. Dogs padded along the village paths, tails wagging lazily. Every being, human and animal alike, seemed to conform to the same patient rhythm that defined the village. Meanwhile, in a distant city of ancient Egypt, life unfolded with a similar unhurried cadence, though the environment was entirely different. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across limestone buildings and dusty streets. Workers carried baskets of grain along canals, their steps measured to avoid spilling their loads. Builders adjusted stones for pyramids with careful precision, lifting, rotating, and setting each one with slow, deliberate effort. The sound of tools against stone was rhythmic, soothing, blending into the low murmur of voices discussing tasks in the shade. Merchants arranged wares on mats, arranging pottery, textiles, and small trinkets with meticulous care. Buyers wandered slowly, examining items in detail, sometimes moving back and forth before deciding, and often deciding not to buy at all. The marketplace itself was alive, yet in a calm, methodical way, more a ballet of patience than a chaotic scene of trade. The sounds of footsteps, barter, and wind across stone columns formed a gentle background as hypnotic as any lullaby. Even along the Nile, fishermen cast their nets with precision, pulling in their catch slowly, evenly, methodically. The river flowed gently, its waters reflecting the sun's soft morning glow. Birds dipped into the water and rose again, moving in a slow, purposeful rhythm that mirrored the actions of men and women along its banks. Life itself seemed to expand, stretching minutes into what felt like hours, and hours into a continuous, soothing, present moment. Back in medieval Europe, villagers prepared meals for the day. Bread was sliced slowly, butter spread deliberately. Children carried small plates to the table, moving cautiously to avoid dropping food. Conversations were muted, often repeating trivial details about weather, crops, or chores. Nothing was urgent. Nothing was dramatic. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to a rhythm that was hypnotic in its predictability. Farmers moved in the fields with similar calmness. Plowing, sowing, and tending crops required steady, patient labor. Horses pulled plows at a measured pace, soil turned with slow, deliberate effort, and seeds were planted one by one, carefully spaced. Even the occasional mishap, a dropped tool or a wandering chicken, was absorbed seamlessly into the day's rhythm. Everything, from sunup to sundown, followed the same gentle cadence. In Egyptian workshops, scribes meticulously copied hieroglyphs onto papyrus. Their quills moved slowly, deliberately, forming precise lines and curves, each stroke repeated until perfect. The repetitive task, though tedious, was a practice in patience and focus. Occasionally, a scribe would pause to stretch or adjust their position, but always with measured care, never in haste. The soft scratching of quills on papyrus, combined with the distant murmur of conversation and the flowing Nile, created a hypnotic atmosphere that could easily lull one into drowsiness. Even the rulers observed the rhythm of their societies from afar. Kings and pharaohs attended brief, measured councils, discussing minor details of taxation, food storage, or building maintenance. Decisions were deliberate, often slow, and frequently postponed until absolutely necessary. There were no dramatic proclamations or heroic gestures. Instead, there was the persistent, quiet management of everyday life, attended to with care, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. The streets, workshops, homes, and fields of these ancient civilizations, whether in Europe or Egypt, were filled with actions that may seem boring at first glance, yet each was essential. Each step, swing of a hammer, stroke of a quill, placement of a stone, or measured conversation contributed to the ongoing pattern of life. The rhythm of these ordinary activities was subtle but powerful, a cadence that shaped the lives of millions while remaining almost imperceptible. Even mundane disputes were handled slowly. A disagreement over property boundaries, a spilled bucket of grain, or a missing tool was addressed calmly, deliberately, with careful attention to fairness and detail. There were no shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Resolution took time, and that time was measured, deliberate, and unhurried. Every word, gesture, and action was part of the quiet pattern that defined life in these times. As evening approached, villages settled into a gentle calm. Fires were lit in hearths, smoke drifting upward in lazy spirals. Families gathered for quiet meals, talking softly of their day's work. In Egypt, lanterns glowed along riverbanks, reflecting in the water and casting soft, shimmering light on stone walls and canals. The flow of the Nile, the shifting shadows of city streets, the slow movements of merchants, workers, and animals all contributed to a hypnotic cadence, a gentle pulse that stretched time and quieted the mind. Evenings were filled with preparation for the next day. Tools were cleaned, animals fed, fires banked, and plans reviewed. Each action was deliberate, careful, and slow. There was no rush, no dramatics, no sudden events to jolt attention. The ordinary, mundane details of life, so often overlooked in stories of heroism and adventure, were here fully present, unfolding in an unbroken, soothing rhythm. The story of everyday life in ancient Europe and Egypt is not one of wars, grand conquests, or heroic exploits. It is a story of patience, care, and the gentle unfolding of ordinary tasks. It is the rhythmic passage of time through slow, deliberate actions, each contributing to the continuity of life. Every swing of a tool, step of a worker, or stroke of a quill forms part of a quiet, meditative pattern that can lull the mind into rest. As night fully descended, the streets, workshops, and fields grew quiet. The occasional soft murmur of voices, the distant bark of a dog, or the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze punctuated the stillness. Time seemed to stretch, and the hypnotic rhythm of ordinary life persisted, a soothing cadence that carried the listener gently toward sleep. In this slow, measured, and deliberate unfolding of life, the essence of history is revealed not through dramatic feats, but through the quiet, persistent, and often boring actions that make civilization endure. The rhythm of everyday life, repeated over and over across centuries, is a meditation on patience, routine, and the beauty hidden in the ordinary, unnoticed moments of human existence. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the misty morning of a small medieval village. Thatched roofs glistened with dew, and cobblestone streets reflected the muted gold of the sun. Villagers stirred slowly, not in excitement, but in the deliberate rhythm of habit. Chickens clucked softly as they moved from one yard to another, and the faint hum of a mill wheel turning in the distance lent a gentle, unhurried pulse to the waking day. This was the calm before the festival, a world where anticipation itself unfolded in a measured, almost sleep-inducing cadence. In the village square, preparations for the annual festival began with deliberate, meticulous care. Long tables were carried into place by a group of villagers, each step measured so that the legs did not scratch the stones. Banners, stitched from dull-colored cloth, were unfurled slowly and tied carefully to poles, ensuring they would hang evenly. A group of children followed behind, carrying small bundles of straw for decorations, their movements tentative, cautious, almost ceremonious. Every action, no matter how minor, contributed to the unhurried rhythm of the morning. The festival itself was a peculiar spectacle, filled with traditions that were both elaborate and bizarre, yet executed at an unhurried pace. One of the earliest events involved a tug-of-war between villagers and visiting peasants from a neighboring town. The rope, thick and worn, was laid across the center of the square. The participants lined up slowly, checking their grip, adjusting footing, and stretching their arms. No one rushed. The pull of the rope began almost imperceptibly, a gradual, measured tension that lasted several long minutes. Each tug and heave was deliberate, exaggerated, and repeated multiple times, creating a hypnotic, repetitive rhythm that drew attention to the minutiae of effort rather than any dramatic victory. Nearby, a cheese rolling event took place on a gentle slope. A round wheel of cheese, polished smooth, was placed at the top of a small hill. The villagers and a few adventurous youth prepared to chase it, but even their running was slow, tentative, careful to avoid tripping on uneven grass or stones. The wheel of cheese rolled with a lazy momentum, sometimes wobbling, sometimes rolling straight, and the participants followed in a rhythm almost meditative in its slowness. Laughter, if it appeared, was subdued, gentle, and spaced out in long pauses that mirrored the pace of motion. In another corner of the village square, a group of older villagers prepared a mock joust using wooden sticks and low, padded barriers. Knights in wooden helmets moved in slow arcs, swinging sticks at slow, deliberate angles. Each charge lasted longer than it needed, creating an exaggerated, almost theatrical sense of movement that was comically slow. Observers watched with mild interest, occasionally commenting in hushed tones about the technique or the awkwardness of a swing. There were no crashes or dramatic falls. Everything occurred within a patient, controlled pace, emphasizing ritual over action. Even the market stalls integrated into the festival followed this unhurried rhythm. Merchants arranged fruits, vegetables, and small trinkets with extreme care. Buyers wandered slowly, examining every item, turning it in their hands, measuring weight, inspecting texture, and then placing it back with meticulous precision. Each exchange took several long moments, and conversations were filled with drawn-out pleasantries. Discussions of the weather, minor disputes over prices resolved calmly, and repeated affirmations of agreements. There was no urgency, only a soothing, hypnotic cadence. Across the square, performers prepared for their acts with exaggerated slowness. Jugglers tossed small balls in rhythmic patterns, deliberately timing each throw and catch. Minstrels plucked strings of lutes and lyres with careful, measured strums, each note held slightly longer than necessary. Storytellers, tasked with recounting local legends or histories, spoke in slow, drawn-out sentences, emphasizing every syllable, stretching moments of minor drama into extended pauses. The audience listened with patience, sometimes nodding, sometimes drifting into contemplation, almost hypnotized by the deliberate pacing. Bizarre traditions were equally meticulous. In one corner, a pillow fight on stilts was set up. Participants climbed slowly onto short wooden stilts, adjusting their balance carefully. The swings of pillows were slow and deliberate, more ceremonial than competitive. Observers whispered in amusement at the awkwardness of the motions, but no one rushed. The event lasted longer than necessary, yet every extended movement added to the mesmerizing tempo of the festival. Even small acts, such as awarding prizes, were drawn out with ceremonial precision. Winners were called slowly, names pronounced deliberately, hands extended carefully for modest trophies. Applause followed, measured and spaced, emphasizing the passage of time and careful attention to every detail. The repetition of gestures, names, and minor accolades created a hypnotic rhythm, as though the very act of recognition itself was part of the festival's calming cadence. Elsewhere, villagers engaged in traditional dances. Pairs moved around the square in circular formations, steps choreographed, but executed with exaggerated slowness. Each turn, bow, and gesture was deliberate, with long pauses between actions. The music accompanying the dance was soft and measured, drums and flutes blending into a continuous, almost lullaby-like rhythm. The dancers' faces, though cheerful, showed focus and concentration. Each movement performed with care, extending the sensation of slow, soothing motion for the observer. In the background, craftsmen displayed unusual inventions and curiosities. Wooden devices that spun slowly, small automata with jerky, exaggerated movements, and mechanical animals moving in hypnotic loops drew quiet attention. Children and adults alike observed them with slow fascination, noting minor quirks and adjustments. Even these devices, though intended to amuse or impress, moved at a pace that reinforced the overall slow, meditative tempo of the festival. As the day wore on, the pace never dramatically increased. Feasting was slow, conversations soft, and laughter gentle. People moved from one event to another with careful consideration, not hurriedly. Even minor conflicts, such as disagreements over space in the square or the order of performances, were resolved patiently, methodically, with repeated gestures and long deliberations. Nothing occurred suddenly. Everything adhered to the festival's slow, hypnotic rhythm. By evening, the festival drew to a close with a gentle procession. Torches were lit, their flames small and steady, casting warm light across the square. Musicians played softly, their notes drawn out, carrying a sense of closure rather than excitement. Villagers walked home slowly, carrying small gifts or leftovers from the day, animals following with measured steps. The cobblestones echoed with the soft shuffle of feet, blending seamlessly with the distant, lazy call of night birds. Even the cleanup of the festival adhered to the unhurried tempo. Tables were dismantled, banners furled, and debris collected carefully, each movement deliberate and precise. Children helped, learning the rhythm of responsibility and patience. Adults moved with quiet efficiency, performing repetitive tasks with minimal conversation, yet maintaining focus and care. The village returned to its ordinary, steady pace, the festival's hypnotic cadence lingering in the air like a soft echo. As night fell fully, rooftops glimmered under the pale moonlight, shadows stretching across empty streets. The village lay still, except for occasional murmurs from homes or the soft footsteps of night watchmen patrolling at a deliberate pace. The memory of the festival, with its slow, exaggerated, and meticulous events, persisted as a gentle pulse within the community, a rhythm that mirrored the slow, patient unfolding of human life itself. The story of medieval festivals and bizarre traditions, often told as lively, colorful, and chaotic, is in reality a tale of deliberate, methodical movements, extended pauses, and slow, hypnotic rituals. Each swing of a stick, step in a dance, bite of food, or measured word contributes to a calm, soothing cadence. It is a history not of excitement or urgency, but of patience, careful repetition, and gentle, hypnotic flow. A perfect companion for the listener seeking tranquility and the slow, comforting embrace of sleep. By night, as torches burned low and the last notes of music faded, the village returned to quiet normalcy. The rhythms of everyday life, extended and amplified through ceremonial acts, continued to hum softly beneath the surface. In every step, motion, and sound, the hypnotic, calming essence of ordinary, slow-moving history could be felt, inviting rest, meditation, and gentle reflection. The days blurred together in ways that are difficult to imagine now. There were no calendars pinned to walls, no clocks to measure time with precision. The family measured their days by the rhythm of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the repetition of tasks that began and ended with near-perfect sameness. To live then was to surrender to cycles. Work, hunger, brief rest, and work again. Morning after morning, the family rose in darkness, guided only by the faintest gray on the horizon and the familiar crackle of a fire that was coaxed back to life from half-dead embers. There was no luxury of hesitation. The mother's hands, raw from years of washing, scrubbing, and sewing, worked instinctively as she stirred the coals, turning them carefully until the fire returned. Her face was lined not by age alone, but by the relentless burden of unchanging days. She had learned long ago that every moment wasted at dawn was a debt repaid with exhaustion at dusk. The children woke slowly, but not with complaints. They understood, perhaps more deeply than modern minds could imagine, that life did not bend for their moods. Their beds of straw scratched at their skin, the quilts barely warm enough to shield against the cold creeping through the thin wooden walls. Still, they rose, rubbing sleep from their eyes, stretching limbs that ached despite their youth. Childhood was brief and fleeting, replaced quickly by duty. Even those barely tall enough to reach the table had chores waiting for them. The father's silhouette was the first to vanish into the fields. His shoulders stooped, though his will remained strong. The land was both adversary and lifeline. The soil held promise, but only if persuaded through endless labor. He walked the narrow furrows, ox at his side, plow dragging through the reluctant ground. His boots sank into the damp earth, the leather cracked and softened by years of toil. Each step carried the weight of not just survival, but of hope. That enough grain would grow to feed his family through the winter, that storms would spare the crops, that hunger would not bite too sharply when the snow arrived. Back at the house, the routine unfolded with its own quiet rhythm. The eldest daughter filled buckets at the well. She balanced them carefully, water sloshing dangerously close to the rim, her arms trembling with strain. The younger children collected firewood, their fingers stiff with cold as they grasped rough branches. Sometimes they laughed softly between themselves, racing one another across the yard, but their laughter faded quickly when called back to order. Even joy was rationed, tucked into stolen moments like crumbs saved from bread. The mother tended to the hearth, placing the heavy iron pot back over the flames. Into it went grains, coarse, uneven, yet filling when boiled into porridge. If the hens had laid an egg, she cracked it carefully, stirring it into the mixture to stretch its value across bowls for many. Every meal was measured by necessity, by how far she could divide little into enough. Hunger was a constant shadow, never far, always threatening. To eat was not to indulge, but to endure. As the day stretched on, the fields and the home echoed with labor. The father's hands pressed seeds into earth, his body bent until his back burned. The mother's needle stitched torn garments, her thread thin but steady. The children fetched and carried, swept and scrubbed. Their tasks were small, but each one mattered, for to leave even one undone was to tip the fragile balance of survival. The hours crept slowly, marked only by the changing light. The sun climbed high, burning against skin already roughened by years outdoors, before descending again into the west. Shadows lengthened, and with them came a deep weariness that no amount of rest could ever fully erase. Yet, when evening arrived, the family gathered again around the rough wooden table, their bodies tired but their wills unbroken. Dinner was no more grand than breakfast or lunch. A thin broth simmered in the pot, carrying the faint scent of carrots and salted meat so sparingly used it almost seemed imagined. Bread, when available, was sliced into careful pieces, each portion equal, each crumb cherished. There were no extra helpings, no seconds. To eat beyond one's share meant robbing another of their survival, and such selfishness was unthinkable. The silence of the meal was not heavy, but it was ever present. Conversation was scarce, words saved like food, spoken only when necessary. The children chewed quietly, the parents swallowed with tired discipline. The sound of spoons scraping wooden bowls filled the room more than voices did. Afterward, the chores continued even as darkness fell. Dishes were rinsed in the cold water drawn earlier from the well. Scraps were gathered for animals or saved for tomorrow's broth. The fire was carefully managed, logs rationed, embers tucked under ash to preserve them until morning. The house dimmed as the flames lowered, the world outside already swallowed in black. The children crawled back to their straw beds, pulling quilts tight. Their whispers returned, small voices weaving fragments of dreams and thoughts. Sometimes they spoke of the stars they saw outside, wondering what lay beyond them. But their wonder was short-lived, their bodies too tired to sustain imagination for long. Sleep claimed them quickly, as it always did. The parents lingered in silence, their eyes reflecting the glow of the dying fire. Worries pressed heavily into their thoughts. Would the harvest be enough? Would illness creep into the family when remedies were scarce? Would wolves circle too near the livestock, stealing what little they had? These fears lived in every corner of their lives, unspoken yet omnipresent. But fear had no remedy, no answer. Tomorrow would come regardless, demanding the same toil. And so, like their children, they closed their eyes, knowing rest was as much a duty as labor. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months, and still the cycle continued. Seasons shifted, each bringing its own hardships. Spring meant planting, back-breaking work that offered only the promise of later reward. Summer brought heat that cracked lips and burned skin, but also the fragile hope of growth. Autumn was harvest, the time of frantic labor to gather what the land had given. Winter was survival at its purest, measured by the dwindling of stores, the tightness of belts, the endless cold pressing in against thin walls. Through it all, the family endured. Their names, unknown beyond their small world, would never be written in history books. No chronicler recorded their labors, no monuments were raised in their honor. Yet they lived, and in living, they carried forward the endless line of humanity. Their struggles, quiet and unseen, were the foundation upon which everything else was built. Without them, there would be no kings, no wars, no stories to tell. This was their history, monotonous, exhausting, and silent. A history not of triumphs, but of survival. Not of greatness, but of persistence. A history that echoed across countless families, countless generations, forgotten in detail, but eternal in essence. And when the fire dimmed each night, when the stars wheeled silently overhead, the family lay down once more to rest, knowing that tomorrow would rise like today, and today had risen like yesterday. Such was the rhythm of their lives, unending, uncelebrated, yet profoundly real. The first chill of autumn crept into the air, subtle at first, like a whisper barely heard. Yet the family felt it instantly. After months of unrelenting labor beneath the summer sun, the shift in the wind, the bite in the mornings, was a warning that the most difficult season was fast approaching. Autumn was not a time of rest. It was a season of urgency. Everything that had been planted, tended, and hoped for now stood waiting in the fields, demanding to be gathered before frost could claim it. And so, their days, already filled with labor, grew heavier still. From the earliest light, the father was in the fields, his sickle glinting in the pale dawn as he cut stalk after stalk of grain. The sound of metal slicing through stems was steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Behind him, the older children bundled what he cut, tying stalks into sheaves that could be carried to the storage shed. The ground was damp beneath their feet, the dew soaking through worn shoes. But no one paused. Each hour lost meant a risk of ruin. Crops did not wait, nor did the turning of the season. The mother and younger children worked closer to the house, spreading vegetables to dry, laying out beans and peas carefully on cloth so they would not rot. Root vegetables were checked and sorted, their skins examined for signs of decay. Anything soft or spoiled had to be used immediately. Nothing could be wasted. Not now, when every scrap of food might mean the difference between endurance and hunger in the months ahead. The storage room became the heart of the home during these weeks. Shelves were stacked with jars sealed as tightly as possible. Though sealing was never perfect in those days, salted meat hung from hooks, dried herbs were bundled in rows, and sacks of grain leaned heavily against one another in the corners. The air smelled of earth, wood, and faint spice, a mixture of comfort and anxiety. Comfort because these supplies represented survival. Anxiety because everyone knew how quickly they could disappear once the snows arrived. Evenings did not bring relief. When the fields were too dark to work, the family gathered around the table not only to eat, but to continue labor. By the dim light of a single lamp, the mother mended clothes yet again, her fingers pricked raw from endless sewing. The father sharpened tools for the next day, his stone scraping softly across iron. The children helped sort beans, shell peas, or pick through grains to remove stones. Their eyelids drooped with fatigue, but their hands did not stop until the work was done. The meals were heavier now than in summer. For as long as harvest lasted, there was more food to be had. Fresh bread appeared more often, its scent filling the small room with a fleeting sense of abundance. Potatoes, carrots, and turnips were boiled into stews that tasted far richer than the thin broths of leaner months. The family ate with gratitude, aware that this brief plenty was temporary. The children savored the warmth of bread, the rare taste of butter, and the sweetness of apples picked from the small orchard nearby. But even in this moment of relative fullness, restraint guided every hand. The parents reminded them, save. Always save. What was eaten tonight could not be eaten tomorrow. The father's body bore the season's weight most visibly. His shoulders grew more stooped with each passing day. His hands blistered and calloused from gripping the sickle without pause. He rarely spoke of his pain, though his winces were seen by all. The mother, too, bent under her burdens, her back aching from hours of bending over vegetables and grains. Yet neither allowed themselves rest. Rest was a danger. It tempted weakness, and weakness risked everything. The children, though young, carried this urgency within them. The eldest son hauled sheaves heavier than his strength could bear, his face red from effort. Yet he pressed on. The daughters carried baskets until their fingers were numb, then returned for more. Even the youngest learned to sort beans, her small hands fumbling but persistent. Their laughter, when it came, was quick and quiet, snatched between chores, never lasting long. Nights grew colder as the weeks passed. The family huddled closer to the fire, quilts piled high on the straw beds. The parents lay awake longer, listening to the wind outside, hearing in its whistle the promise of winter's cruelty. They whispered in low tones about how long the grain might last, about whether the cow would remain healthy, about what would happen if illness came. These conversations were not for the children's ears, yet the children heard anyway, their small hearts carrying worries too large for their years. Still, the family endured. Each day ended in exhaustion, but also in a kind of quiet pride. They had gathered what they could, stored what was possible, and prepared as best as human hands could. The rest, storms, sickness, chance, was beyond their control. They could only hope, and hope was a fragile thing, easily broken, but stubborn enough to survive. As autumn deepened, the fields emptied, their golden stalks cut low. The land left bare and brown. The air turned sharper. The trees shed their leaves, and frost appeared on the ground each morning. The cycle shifted again. The harvest was over. Now came the waiting. Winter would test all that they had done, measuring their labor against hunger, their endurance against cold. And so, on the final night of harvest, the family gathered not just to eat, but to acknowledge in silence what had been achieved. Their meal was simple but hearty, their faces lit by the warm glow of fire and faint hope. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, not out of indulgence, but out of gratitude that there was something to eat at all. The world outside was vast, uncaring, and cold. Inside, in their small home, a family prepared to face it together, carrying forward in silence, their lives unmarked by history, yet carved deeply into the endless story of survival. The first snow arrived earlier than expected. It came quietly in the night, blanketing the ground in white silence, as though the earth itself had been muffled. When the family awoke that morning, the world outside their small home had changed. The trees, now bare of leaves, stood stiff and dark against the pale sky. The fields where they had labored so relentlessly through summer and autumn were hidden beneath the snow, their empty stalks and furrows erased in a single night. For the children, the sight was magical, even beautiful. But for the parents, it was a reminder that the hardest season of all had begun. Winter was not simply a change of weather. It was a test of endurance, patience, and survival. The family now lived within the boundaries of their home, with the outside world reduced to the woodshed, the frozen barn, and the occasional path broken through snow to fetch water. Their labor had not ended. It had only shifted. Instead of tending fields, they now tended fire, food, and health. Every day became a calculation. How much wood to burn, how much food to use, how much to save. The father rose before the rest of the house to stoke the fire. The hearth was the heart of their world now. Without it, life could not continue. The fire had to be fed constantly, and though the family had cut and stacked wood through the warmer months, each log burned was a reminder that the pile would one day shrink to nothing. He split kindling until his hands were numb, the axe ringing out into the frozen stillness. His breath hung in the air, white and fleeting, as he worked. The mother's days were spent managing food. The root cellar was her kingdom, its shelves lined with jars and sacks, its cool, damp air filled with the smell of stored vegetables and dried herbs. Each meal was measured carefully. A handful of beans stretched with turnips into a stew. A piece of dried meat boiled with potatoes to flavor broth. Bread was rationed, baked sparingly to make flour last. Waste was unthinkable. Every crumb, every scrap of peel or bone had a use. The children were reminded constantly, nothing must be thrown away. The children, restless from confinement, learned quickly that winter allowed little idleness. The eldest son went with his father to the barn each day, checking on the cow and hens, breaking ice so the animals could drink. His face reddened with cold, his fingers raw, but he did not complain. The daughters carried water, fetched wood, mended clothes beside their mother, and watched the youngest. Even the littlest child had tasks: sorting dried beans, gathering kindling from beneath the snow, carrying small loads where she could. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the slow shortening of firewood and food. Outside, storms swept through, sometimes for days at a time. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, rattling shutters and seeping through cracks in the walls. Snow piled higher, burying fences and paths, isolating the family further from the world beyond. Travel became dangerous, almost impossible. The family understood. They were alone now, reliant only on what they had done before the snow came. Evenings were the hardest. Darkness fell early, stretching long hours between sunset and sleep. The single lamp burned low to conserve oil, and the family sat close to the fire, shadows flickering on the walls. The mother sewed by dim light, patching clothes already patched too many times. The father carved small repairs for tools, his knife glinting faintly in the fire's glow. The children whispered or listened to stories told in soft voices, tales of ancestors, of hard winters survived before, of endurance passed down like inheritance. Hunger became a constant presence. At first it was faint, an emptiness between meals. But as the weeks stretched on, the meals grew thinner, the portions smaller. Bread was cut in slivers. Stew was stretched with water until it was little more than broth. The children's eyes followed every piece of food as it was served, though they learned not to ask for more. Their parents gave them what they could, often eating less themselves, though they did not say it aloud. Illness, too, crept in. The cold weakened bodies, and coughs spread quickly in the small, crowded room. When fever came to the youngest, the family's worry deepened. The mother sat by her side night after night, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, whispering comfort. The father paced by the fire, helpless but unable to sit still. The other children watched in silence, their faces tight with fear. There were no doctors nearby, no medicines beyond herbs and prayers. Each day the fever lingered, felt like a test of fate itself. Still, there were moments of light. On rare clear days, when the sun broke through and glistened on the snow, the children were allowed to play outside for a short time. Their laughter rang out across the frozen yard, bright and sharp against the silence of winter. They built shapes in the snow, chased one another, and forgot, for a moment, the weight of hunger and cold. Their cheeks flushed red, their eyes bright. They carried warmth back into the dim house with them. The parents watched, tired but grateful. Such moments reminded them why they endured. Time became a blur of sameness, measured in the slow dwindling of supplies. The family's resilience was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. Each day survived was its own small victory. They had no calendar, but they knew spring was still far away. Until then, the fire must not go out, the food must not run out, and the family must hold together. Outside, the world lay silent beneath the snow, uncaring. Inside, in that small home, a family lived on through patience, labor, and hope. Their story was not written in books, not remembered in history. Yet it was one of countless such stories, repeated across generations, ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary endurance. And so the winter deepened, pressing harder with each week, as if testing the family's strength. The outcome was uncertain, the future unknown. But for now, they endured. The winter stretched on longer than anyone could have imagined. Weeks blurred into months, each day beginning with the same fragile routines and ending with quiet exhaustion. The snow lay thick across the land, undisturbed except for the faint tracks of the family's movements. The paths to the well, the barn, the small patch of forest where wood could be gathered. Beyond that, the world seemed empty, cold and infinite. Inside, the family clung to one another, drawing warmth and courage from proximity, even as hunger and fatigue gnawed relentlessly. Mornings began before dawn. Always. The father stirred first, his back aching, muscles stiff, hands raw from splitting wood that would feed the fire throughout the long day. Each log placed on the hearth carried with it the weight of necessity. The mother followed soon after, her fingers moving with the practiced precision of countless seasons. She checked the jars, measured out portions of grain and flour, and stirred what little remained in the pot. The children awoke slowly, groaning as they pulled thin blankets around them, their limbs stiff from cold and restless sleep. Yet no one lingered. The day demanded attention, and inattention could be fatal. Breakfast was a simple affair, barely enough to sustain energy for the labor ahead. Bread, if it had lasted, was rationed to fractions of slices. Stew or broth was thin, flavored with roots, herbs, and the occasional scrap of salted meat. Each mouthful was swallowed deliberately, no morsel wasted. The children, though weary, ate quietly, mindful of the scarcity that framed every part of their lives. Even the youngest learned that appetite was a luxury, not a right. Tasks were endless. Water had to be carried from the partially frozen well, broken into pieces and melted over the fire. Firewood had to be split, tended, and rationed. Clothing was patched and repaired, over and over again, until it barely retained its function. The father checked on the animals, scraping frost from the cow's water trough, coaxing the hens to lay even when the cold had made their bodies slow. The mother cooked, cleaned, sewed, and oversaw the children's chores, her back bending beneath the weight of endless responsibility. Hunger became a constant presence, not merely felt but understood in every movement. The body grew thinner, strength waned, and yet work could not stop. Meals were eaten quickly, without delight, because energy had to be conserved for the labor that defined survival. Conversation was minimal. Words were too precious to waste. Even laughter was rare, fleeting, snatched only in the stolen minutes when the children played quietly near the fire or shaped the snow outside, their cheeks red with exertion and cold. Illness lingered like a shadow. The youngest child, who had first fallen sick weeks ago, now slept more than played, her body fragile against the cold and hunger. The mother tended her constantly, pressing warm cloths to her forehead, whispering comfort and hope. The father watched, helpless, rage and fear twisting in silence. The other children, unable to fully understand, absorbed the tension quietly, their small hearts learning endurance early. Time lost meaning. Days became indistinguishable from nights. The snow outside reflected dimly the pale light of the short winter sun, barely rising above the horizon before setting again. The wind pressed against the walls, rattling shutters, sweeping ice through cracks in the boards. Each storm brought new hardships, frozen water, buried paths, and the danger of being trapped indoors without enough firewood. The family's movements became careful, calculated, precise. Every action had to preserve energy, food, and warmth. Mistakes could be deadly. Still, they endured. They endured because they had no other option. They endured because generations before them had endured in the same way, through the same bitter cold, through the same relentless cycles of scarcity and survival. In their endurance, there was a quiet heroism, unseen and unrecorded. Every meal prepared, every log split, every child carried to safety represented a victory over circumstance. By midwinter, the family had settled into a rhythm dictated entirely by survival. Mornings were for the hardest work: chopping, hauling, fetching water. Midday was for tending the hearth and food. Evenings, spent huddled close to the fire, were for repair, preparation, and whispering reassurance to one another. There was little variation, little joy beyond the brief, stolen moments of warmth or laughter. Yet, these moments carried weight. They were proof that life persisted despite everything. Food ran dangerously low. Grain was measured in tablespoons, and every crumb counted. The pot, once brimming with porridge, now held only enough for a small bowl per person. Bread, baked sparingly, lasted barely a day. The family ate in shifts if necessary, older children often giving up portions to younger ones. Hunger sharpened senses, frayed tempers, and yet also strengthened bonds. Every sacrifice became a silent act of love, though it was seldom spoken aloud. The father, older now in spirit, if not in years, worked with a quiet determination born of desperation. He repaired the barn, reinforced the doors against the wind, ensured that the cow would not freeze and that the hens had enough warmth to survive. His body ached, his hands bled, yet he persisted, knowing that failure would mean the end of survival. The mother's resilience was no less remarkable. She stitched, scrubbed, cooked, and comforted, her body trembling with fatigue, her mind never resting. She carried the children's fears as though they were her own, and their smallest triumphs, finding a hidden root, a saved scrap of food, brought her silent satisfaction. She rarely spoke of her exhaustion, rarely allowed herself a moment to sit, for the day's demands were unending. By late winter, the snow had reached such depth that the outside world seemed erased. The family rarely ventured beyond the immediate perimeter of their home. Their lives became concentric circles of survival. Hearth, food storage, barn, woodshed. The rest of the land existed only as memory or imagination. They moved quietly, speaking only when necessary, preserving energy and warmth. Even the children's laughter was subdued, a careful note in the symphony of endurance. And then, gradually, imperceptibly, the weather began to change. The sun rose slightly higher in the sky. Snow softened in places. Icicles dripped in slow, deliberate rhythms from the roof. The promise of spring, faint as it was, arrived like a whispered hope. The family felt it in their bones before they could measure it. Work remained, but the nature of it shifted. The earth thawed, allowing paths to open. Water flowed freely from the well. The cow began to move more easily, and the hens pecked more actively at the ground. Survival had been maintained through winter, and now a new cycle began. Preparation for planting, tending the land once more, a future uncertain, yet alive. By the time the first green shoots appeared through thawed soil, the family had changed. They were thinner, older in spirit, their bodies carrying the invisible weight of months spent in relentless endurance. Their hands were cracked, their feet sore, their backs bent. Yet they moved with quiet pride. They had survived the season that could have ended them. They had endured hunger, cold, illness, and fear. And through it all, they had remained together. In the small, unmarked home, the hearth still glowed, the food stores slowly replenished, and the family prepared for the labor that lay ahead. The children played briefly, their laughter returning in small bursts, a fragile but enduring proof of life. The parents watched, silently acknowledging that though nothing about their lives had changed in spectacle, everything had changed in significance. Every day survived, every small victory claimed, had built a foundation stronger than any monument, deeper than any record. The winter had ended, but its lessons remained. Resilience, endurance, and quiet perseverance were no longer abstract virtues. They were lived, felt, and etched into every fiber of the family's being. The cycle of seasons would continue, work would persist, and life would demand effort once more. But now, having survived the harshest test, the family faced the future with a muted, enduring hope. Their story, like countless others, remained unwritten in books, unremembered by the wider world. Yet its reality was undeniable. Life had been harsh, slow, and repetitive, yet it had been lived fully, honestly, and with a quiet courage that defined every ordinary moment. And so the family moved forward, into spring, into labor, into the endless cycle of human endurance. The hearth remained, the snow receded, and life, fragile and uncelebrated, continued, just as it always had, just as it always would.